the mirror all morning.
All right, that's
And
good.
followed by Holly Dunn. Adrian's from Benedict College, just up the road here from Charleston in Columbia, South Carolina. Holly Dunn's from University of South Florida in Tampa. And Chris Ippolito is from Georgia Tech. So welcome everybody. And what we'll do is, what do you think? 15 minutes? Can you do it in 15 minutes?
Yeah, that's
So I'll
fine.
give you the heads up when there's 5 minutes left, then 2 minutes left, and then viciously cut you off. But I think it's a small group, and so we're not really hugely pressed for time. So that gives us a good 45 minutes or 40 minutes to chat afterwards. But if you go over a couple of minutes, it's not the end of the world. All right, does that sound good?
All right.
And I'm Chris Day from the College of Charleston, and also I'm from Sarasas as well. So with that, why don't we go ahead and hand it over to Adrian and Vazi, go ahead. Welcome.
Okay. I cannot share my screen.
You should be able to now.
Now. All right. Okay, so everyone see my screen here?
Yep.
Yes. All right. So let's start with slideshow. All right. So this is actually a chapter of a book that I'm trying to write in this pandemic area, but I started this project 2 or 3 years ago. So the title is Political Stability, what it is, and it should be amended to say that does it still matter? That's a real problem. So I will start with the purpose of a research and rationale for a research. And then I will talk about the concept itself, the concept of political stability, which actually was able to defeat one of the major concepts of the 50s, 1950s and 1960s, which was the concept of political order. But now political stability is losing the kind of a competition to other concepts, which will be the concept of state failure and the most powerful concept right now is state fragility. So everyone seems to be moving towards these new concepts. But I think stability is still a useful concept. And I will talk a little bit about the definition that I'm adopting in my research and the measurement. And I will end with why political stability still matters today. So in 2017, I completed a book on the political crisis in Madagascar, the political crisis of March 2009, which was published by Rowan and Littlefield. But as soon as I finished that book, I realized that a political crisis is not actually the most, problematic, most difficult challenge for Africa. It actually, you have crisis for just a brief period of time, a brief moment in the nation history, but the stability or instability is really I would say the condition that take a longer period of time, a longer moment, and that may have greater negative or positive effect or impact on the nation. So I start to read about political stability, not only in the case of Madagascar, but also in the case of other African countries. And I found out that most of the African countries, and I actually made the calculation based on the data from the World Bank. I realized that Africa as a whole and all African countries are actually less stable than the other continent and other countries in the world. So I started this project in 2018. I got a sabbatical in 2019, which allowed me to collect a lot of data. And I will untitle the book, The Elusive Quest for Political Stability in Post-Cold War Africa. And the objective is just to understand the causes of political instability in Africa. So that's the purpose and rationale for my current project. So let's talk about the concepts themselves. So originally, I think the main concepts that were captivating most political scientists around the world was political order. Most of us may remember, if you are old enough, to take comparative politics in the 1990s and 2000s. Huntington, political order in a changing society. That is a very important book. But somehow political order was replaced in the 1970s by a new concept, and that is the concept of political stability or political instability. I did not see any clear explanation of why political stability would be a better concept than political order. And if you read the literature today, it's only Fukuyama who's still using this concept of political order, but everyone else seems to be moving away from that concept, either using the concept of political stability, instability, or state failure or state fragility. So I did not see any clear concept, any clear explanation of why stability is not a good, no, political order is not a good concept, but I suspect that the move away from political order was due to the definitions and the measurement of the two concepts. Whereas political order is kind of difficult to measure and also difficult to really to define. We can, think that the order is actually the state of things. So there's no way to really measure the state of things. It's just like the word order. So even if you have disorder, that is still an order in a disorder. So there's no way really to measure what is order compared to stability, where you can have some assessment of what you think is stable and what you think is not stable. So I think that's a move away from political order to political stability. And there are many definitions, and the early, and which seems to be a definition that was accepted by many people in the literature, was Claude Ake definition, which says that political stability is the regularity of the flow of political exchange. But himself, he had trouble measuring, this regularity of political flows. And as a result, he did not have any database on political stability. So there are many other definitions, many other measurements of a concept, but most of them seems to be turning around, the conflict, and it starts with, I think, with Raynald Carroll who wrote about the political system and stability. And it's about you have stability when you don't have conflict, and you have instability when you have conflicts. So I think most of the definition right now is turning around that idea of conflict. So the definition that is most widely used today is the definition by Kaufman and his associates who are working in the World Bank under a project of a world governance indicators as a WGI. And according to Kaufman and his associates, stability is really the likelihood that the government will or will not be destabilized or overthrown by unconstitutional or violent means, including politically motivated violence and terrorism. So the main idea here and the key word is really overthrow of government. So if you don't have a regular constitutional and peaceful transfer of power, which means you have predictability in terms of transfer of power, then you have instability. So that's one strand of idea here. But the other strand of idea that make up this concept of stability is really the existence of violence, which include terrorism. So I think that's a definition that most people are using, and actually many people who are doing research on political stability use the database from the World Bank, and actually Kaufman is working, I believe, for the World Bank. He's not a World Bank employee, but he's working for the World Bank and maintain this database on world governance indicator. And the world governance indicator include 6 dimensions of governance, and you have, most of you may be familiar with rule of law, but you have also a voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence and terrorism, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. So that's, I think, is the most widely accepted definition of political stability and instability. And we have also a database attached to that definition. But somehow in recent years, and I happen to have a meeting with some World Bank representatives. That was just a random meeting that I met these people, and they're not talking about stability anymore. They are actually focusing on fragility. And I was asking the question, why don't you use the term stability, but fragility? And fragility doesn't seem to me to be a practical and useful concept. But that is the situation today. Political stability lost the competition to these other concepts. So one of them is fragility, and the other that was used after the, really at the end of the Cold War, was state failure. And state failure actually became state fragility. So if you happen to have read the book by Susan Woodward, The Ideology of a Failed State, she actually argued that the World Bank move away from state failure because that concept seems to be insulting to African countries. So fragility is more acceptable, less insulting to the African countries. So that's, I think, the situation today. The definitions are not widely accepted. Nobody seems to be able to define clearly what is fragility. But there are at least two databases related to state fragility. One is the State Fragility Index by the Center of Systemic Peace. That's the people who are creating the Polity 1, 2, 3, 4, and even 5 today. So you have that database from the Center of Systemic Peace, but you have also the most commonly used in the literature, especially the one that is used by the World Bank is the Fragile State Index. That is maintained by the Fund for Peace. And I think that's what is most popular today. But I think, and that's my argument, and I have to, when I start the project, I thought that everyone agree with the importance of stability, but right now I think that's not the case anymore. So I have to fight to make this concept, still useful. And I try to compare it with the other concepts. So let's look at the correlation between political stability, fragility, the two sets of measurement of fragility, and compare them with the economic and human development performance. So let's look at the correlation. So if you look at the correlation, stability is at the top. Stability seems to be a very had a strong correlation with a Fund for Peace stability index, fragility index. You have 80, negative 0.8%, negative 0.8 with FSI, but you have less than that. Actually, it's close with the Center of Systemic Peace Index.
Adrian, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you've had 15 minutes. But go ahead and wrap up your presentation.
All right.
But don't hurt yourself.
I'll be done in 15 minutes. So with regard to the economic performance, and this is around the world, stability actually does not correlate well with the income per capita, the GNI per capita. You have only 0.58 the correlation, but that's a significant correlation. And we in terms of the correlation with HDI, the Human Development Index, it's 0.6. So based on this correlation figure and matrix, it seems that FSI seems to be doing well with HDI, and also no, SFI seems to do well with HDI, negative 0.86, but FSI seems to do well also with HDI, but the score, the correlation is better with regard to the income per capita. But even we have this figure, I think stability is still useful concept, and the reason for me to say that is that there is no, first of all, there's no clear definition. I try to read what they say in in the World Bank website about fragility, but I'm not really convinced about the usefulness of this concept. Not only that, we don't have a kind of neutral point. You don't have a threshold of what is fragile and what is not. So there's not a kind of zero point or a threshold from where fragility starts or non-fragility would start. So that makes stability more, I would say, more useful than fragility. So that's my first point. The other point that I'm, trying to make also in my book is that the measurement of fragility is based on other measurements. So we have a kind of aggregate measurement, whereas stability is based on, the perception of survey respondents. So it's based on a perception of observers. So in terms of methodology, we are using, the so-called intersubjectivity. So if everyone is agreeing that a state is stable or not stable, that may be better than basing the measurement of something according to other variables. So that's my argument. And since we have the database that allow us to have these thresholds, we can conduct cross-sectional and longitudinal studies on stability. And we can also distinguish stable states from unstable states, because like I said earlier, we have the 0 point, you have that neutral point from where stability starts and instability starts. So in terms of practicality, I think the concept of stability is still useful. So that's my argument. So based on that, I will finish with some figures here. So if we compare, once again, the economic performance of stable states to the unstable state, we can see that the stable state on the left hand side of the screen here, they perform better really compared to the unstable state. So that's in terms of income, and in terms of human development index. You can see also the difference between stable states on the left and unstable state on the right. Do I still have some time? No.
No, you've gone 10 minutes over.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right, I'll finish here. I'll stop
Okay.
here. All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrian. Next up, we have Professor Holly Dunn. The Logic of Popular Justice in Response to Witchcraft in the Eastern DRC.
Thank you. Yeah, this is my first time doing the Zoom presentation, so I don't know if I've got this right. Is this good? Can you see the presentation? Or am I doing this the wrong way?
Yeah.
It's good?
Yeah, you're in good shape.
Okay, cool. So similarly, this is a book chapter for those of you who were at the Emerging Scholars Workshop yesterday. I'm sorry, this is gonna all be very familiar to you because it is what I was presenting there and getting feedback on. So, in the future I would maybe do 2 different chapters. Anyway, so I'm going to first sort of lay out the argument of the book and the broader research project, and then I'll situate this chapter within it. So the sort of guiding questions and context for the broader book project is looking at how people engage with internationalized legal reforms, typically sort of implemented through rule of law building projects in their everyday lives. And what is the role of legal consciousness in this particular context in the construction of legality? So looking at legality beyond just state law, but integrating the variety of legal justice practices, institutions, and beliefs within that. I use a case, my case is the Eastern DRC, and most of my fieldwork was done in Uvira, which is in South Kivu. I'll get into the fieldwork in a second. But a bit of the sort of scholarly context for why I think this is sort of an interesting question is, you know, the rule of law scholarship I see as being kind of cyclical, as well as the practice, the rule of law sort of intervention practice, where we have conflict contexts, right, that are understood internationally as being defined by sort of lawlessness. And so when we have interventions to build for peace building and state building, rule of law building is inevitably one of those. And for those of you sort of familiar with that scholarship, the rule of law is the cure-all for everything. It promotes democracy, economic development, education, everything is resolved through the rule of law. So they sort of implement the rule of law predominantly through institution building, right? So building courts, providing resources, training judges, lawyers, rewriting laws, etc. And then to a certain extent by educating the population as well to inform them of the sort of legal reforms that have happened. Then this is assessed. So how did we do in these rule of law building projects? And typically the research shows that according to their own standards, rule of law building projects typically fail or at the most sort of have ambiguous results. They don't have the results that rule of law interveners anticipate, expect, and are trying to create, which leads to the sort of response to that. What do? Oh, invest more time, resources, and expertise in the exact same type of rule of law building projects. So that's the kind of cycle that I see happening. There have been, you know, decades of critiques of this cycle, and most of those critiques rely on this criticism that, okay, the problem with rule of law building is they don't take into account local culture. But then that dialogue, right, between these two sides sort of stops there. So we have the rule of law building cycle and we have the critiques of it, and then not much really comes of that. So this is kind of where I'm making my intervention. I want to know what is actually happening on the ground, what is produced through these rule of law interventions, not measured from these top-down rule of law measurements, but from the perspective of the local population and their engagements with the law and legality. So that's kind of where the book is going. And I make the argument, you know, to integrate this perspective from the population, not just this top-down approach. And then I argue that legal consciousness is shaped by these encounters. So legal consciousness being people's sort of everyday common sense understandings and interactions with the law and with legal pluralism. So the broader sort of legal justice practices and institutions that exist. Through the legal encounters, legal consciousness has these contradictory elements. So because people are sort of integrating the precepts and practices of liberal legalism as implemented through rule of law building projects, and they also have their more localized justice beliefs, practices, worldviews, both of these are sort of integrated into legal consciousness and often in contradictory ways. So I say this produces sort of contradictory legal consciousness. And this is important. So looking at legal consciousness is important because it helps us understand what sorts of practices are then created, what new patterns of engagement with the law and the sort of broader legal systems that exist. And so I say what happens is we actually have the production of emergent hybrid legality. So people engage with the law in new patterns and in ways that are sort of unanticipated or unexpected from the perspective of interveners, but that also do not conform with sort of traditional practices or anything along those lines. They emerge in the particular context and dependent on local actors and how they're engaging with these different systems as well. And this sort of helps us understand in a more sort of holistic way these unanticipated outcomes of legal interventions, right? That more time, resources, and money is not necessarily going to change the way that rule of law building has these unanticipated outcomes, right? Because they're sort of inevitably going to emerge in unique ways. So the themes of contradictory consciousness that I engage with in the book are informed disenchantment, and I'm not going to get into that one here because it's not part of this chapter so much, disconnect and harm naming, and different logics of justice. And I'm going to explain those in a bit more detail in a minute. And then this outcome of emergent hybrid legality. So the way I understand that, the way I conceptualize that is it's unanticipated. It's not something that can be created in advance, right? So it's not like interveners could say, oh, well, these are great aspects of local justice practices, so let's combine that in a specific way with state law. That's not what emergent hybrid legality is about. It's about these unanticipated and emergent outcomes that are highly contextualized. They depend on the way that actors in that particular context are engaging with the law, as well as sort of what beliefs and practices exist and which ones are being sort of imported or integrated into the formal legal system. And so it's a hybrid. So the methods for the research project I did was 9 months of immersive fieldwork. I did over 100 interviews, both group and individual interviews with legal professionals, local NGOs, members of the local population. I worked with interpreters throughout most of that. I speak French, but my Swahili is not very good. So I was working with interpreters all of that time. And then participant observation. So I observed court proceedings, mediation, and other sorts of informal justice practices. It was very immersive. I lived with a local family, participated in local activities, and did a lot of debriefing with the family I lived with and with my interpreters to ensure I sort of understood better the context, obviously without sort of naming anybody that I was interviewing or interacting with. So how do I situate this particular chapter, which is on witchcraft and popular justice, within the broader framework of the book? It's a specific look at legal encounters in action. So how people make sense of and engage with legal pluralism in relation to this particular issue of witchcraft and witchcraft accusations. It provides evidence of contradictory consciousness and sort of why it forms, and then explores this particular case of witchcraft accusations and popular justice. And emergent hybrid legality. Okay, so the two different themes of contradictory consciousness that I develop in the book and that are sort of engaged with in this chapter, the first one is a disconnect and harm naming. And this is very sort of intuitive. Harms are identified differently by the state and by the local population. That's the disconnect. So with the case of witchcraft, there's a tension between sort of popular knowledge of the law, which does not recognize witchcraft. The state does not formally recognize that witchcraft exists, versus popular worldviews in which witchcraft is an integral part of people's everyday lives and understanding of, as other scholars have argued, an understanding of causality in life, how life works, really. So this is the disconnect. And further, within the law, it's actually a witchcraft accusation that could be seen as a legal offense, right? So not the person who is doing an act of witchcraft, but the person who is accusing somebody else can be prosecuted for something along the lines of slander or libel or something like that. Now, the population experiences witchcraft as an everyday harm. Okay, so it's as I mentioned, sort of this integral part of everyday life. And examples that I bring in from my research, I have a few quotes to sort of demonstrate this. In terms of popular harm naming in the chapter, I provide a sort of vignette that is the story of Naima's life. That's a pseudonym, obviously. And in her situation, right, she had a number of children, and 3 of them had died from witchcraft. This was her interpretation of events. Thanks, Chris. And so, the way that I'm using this story to sort of illustrate the depth of witchcraft in people's everyday lives is that, you know, she had a home, she had land, she had family, she had friends. And when this happened, when her 3 children died as a result of witchcraft, she went to essentially a witch doctor, and the witch doctor determined that was somebody in her family who was the witch who was responsible for this. And she fled, her and her husband and the remaining kids fled everything they had. They totally abandoned their family, their fields, their home, to move to Uvira, where I was doing research, because of this. So this is the sort of real implications of the harm of witchcraft in terms of how people see it. Now with the state, right, they don't recognize it. So this is just a brief excerpt from an interview. I asked somebody, this was following a longer interview, what do people usually do when they suspect someone of witchcraft? And she replied, nothing really. If you go attack the person, it's a mistake because they will imprison you. They will tell you that witchcraft does not exist, referring to the state here. So this sense of powerlessness, right, that the state is not going to help. Moving on to the different logics of justice, similarly, you can imagine, right, that the state, the legal system, is not going to do anything in these cases. And so with the law, the reason for this that people explain to me is they need sort of scientific, rational proof of something as evidence, not what the population referred to as sort of customary or traditional ways of knowing or evidence of witchcraft. So this is just impossible with the state legal system to have that type of evidence. I won't get into mediation for the sake of time, but we can come back to the role of mediation at the end. But then the population, what the population really desires is some form of punishment because of the gravity of the harm, of the harms associated with witchcraft. That's really what they're looking for. And they're not getting it from the state, and they're not getting it through mediation. And this is why people frequently explain that there's a turn to popular justice. And popular justice, you could sort of conceptualize or understand as a type of vigilante justice, sort of ad hoc community involvement, right? Sort of spontaneous justice. And I can also problematize that a little bit because the way it's used has shifted a little bit in recent years, but essentially that's what they're referring to. And the reason that punishment is desired, right, is for personal safety or community safety because of the gravity of the threat of witchcraft. So similarly, here are a few examples from some of my interviews in terms of people explaining these different logics of justice. So somebody said witchcraft is a common problem, but you cannot bring that kind of problem to la justice, which is the state legal system, because there is no proof. There can never be proof of witchcraft in the law, although with custom there is ways, and no judges are witches, so they cannot say that it exists. And I followed up by asking, but most judges aren't rapists, presumably, but they can still recognize that rape exists. For those of you familiar with the context of Congo, sexual violence being, you know, something that's commonly talked about. And they said, yes, but there is proof, and there cannot be proof with witchcraft. So this is sort of people's common understandings of why the state does not prosecute or hear cases of witchcraft. Here's another sort of longer bit of an interview where I asked, have you heard of community members attacking a witch? And Mireille said, when you are a witch and you have already gone too far by killing people, the youths will wait until you are alone and shoot you. I've seen it twice, one man here below, one woman up there. This is referring to sort of the local context of the mountain. And so I asked, what do you think about that? And she said, I don't know, but it is good to discourage witches because we are always afraid. And with our children who are always here and there, God only knows. And I said, do you think there's something else that should happen to witches other than killing them? And she said, killing them is the only thing that is right. So here are my great interviewing skills on display for you all. But essentially, this was a moral thing, right? That this is right. This is what needs to happen. So finally, and where I'm kind of stuck with this chapter is that, you know, I've been conceptualizing these conflicting areas of legal consciousness as leading to emergent hybrid legality. So combining different types of justice into one through the patterns of usage that people have. But with this case, with popular justice, with turning to this sort of spontaneous violence or even more organized violence as it has been more recently, it's hard for me to conceptualize that as a hybrid. So I'm trying to think through what the relationship, what the meaning of this terrain of legal pluralism in the production of popular justice is. And so that's sort of where I'm, this chapter is kind of crumbling a little bit. It's a little bit problematic. So that's sort of where I'm at. The combined contradictory legal consciousness of disconnect and in harm naming and different logics of justice leads to popular justice. But in terms of emergent hybrid legality, is it really a form of that, or how could I fit this in with that broader argument is where I will leave off. I think I have a conclusion page, but it's essentially saying the same thing. So thank you folks very much.
Thanks, all. You got it on the buttons there in terms of time, so nicely done.
Awesome.
All right, I have a couple of questions for you, but I'm going to wait.
Cool.
All right, so Holly, yes, this is the second time me hearing your project, but can you I know this is a chapter, and so can you just for me clarify what's the outcome of interest that you're looking at here? It's the hybridization of sort of informal and formal legal systems. Yeah,
and looking at why why we don't get those sort of rule of law outcomes that when we have so much all these things that international interveners are expecting to lead to them being invested.
Got it.
It's the argument that's not just the lack of institutions or information or trained officials, right? It's because we're actually producing something else.
Right, there's this other stuff going on.
Yeah.
Well, so your question, so the dilemma that you're having right now, is this what you think it is, or is it something else?
Right. Yeah.
So the only thing I could think of is that I wonder if sort of the historical failure of the legal system pushes people into this other informal world. Yeah. I don't know if that's something you've already thought about, probably. Yeah. But I mean, you started off by thinking about people's experiences with the legal system, and they might not be very good. Because just by way of anecdote, when I was doing research in DRC a couple of years ago, I was looking at the rates of prosecution for poachers, and I asked that question, and everybody started laughing, because there's always ways to wiggle out of prosecution for things like that.
Yeah.
So I wonder if people just sort of give up on any kind of taking the formal legal system seriously, and then they retreat into this informal economy of legality dominated by things like witchcraft. So the other thing I was thinking about is like maybe this is a splinter project, is I wonder what's the source of the legitimacy of the witch doctors. The sort of the witch doctor entrepreneurs that might actually might be full of shit. Sort of, not to put too fine a point on it, but they sort of my experience with witchcraft is usually like well, your laptop was stolen, let me hire a witch doctor to find it for you. And oh, look, here it is. And then there's usually some money exchanged, and some of it's real, some of it's instrumental and entrepreneurial. Yeah. But I don't know if that's something that you want to do like on the side. That would be kind of a cool project later. Yeah. All right, so Chris, finally, what I think is I think the study of popular protest in Africa is really important, and you have this really interesting vantage point looking at the social media dimension of it. But I think it's also a really good idea to maybe situate it a little bit more in the broader arc of political protest in Africa. And I would encourage you to look at a couple of books. One is by more recent Lisa Mueller. She has a book on popular protest, and also Adam Branch and Zach Mampilli, who are actually the keynote speakers at the CERSAS conference a few years ago when their book came out about popular protest. So those guys are really good to talk to. And I don't know if you know Zach or Adam, but I'm happy to put you in touch with them. They're friends of CERSAS. Okay. All right, I'll open the floor to any questions or comments from the audience.
Can I jump in?
Who's speaking up? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, it's Ashley. Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sure. So I actually have a couple questions for Holly, and I think maybe this is coming out of I'm reading a lot. I was just reading recently about more of the historical literature on witchcraft and witchcraft accusations in Africa. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about, or if you know anything about the colonial legal history in this region of how witchcraft accusations were actually handled in the past. And I'm thinking a lot about Catherine Longo's work in Kenya, where you have these cases where kind of what we might think of as like informal justice systems and formal justice systems kind of come into conflict as which murder cases of, you know, suspected witches are brought into the colonial courts. And at times, you know, the colonial officials will kind of view accusations of witchcraft as a mitigating factor in considering murder cases. Not because they necessarily believe in witchcraft, because they think people believe in witchcraft. And so I was wondering if you had especially any cases of places where there have been murder prosecutions, people who have murdered witches, are accused witches. And I'm also kind of curious too about, obviously, like, I'm not a legal scholar, but like the legal system is also made up of people who engage and carry it out. And are there cases, so obviously people say like, you know, the legal system as a whole does not recognize witchcraft, but are there judges, are there prosecutors who do believe in witchcraft, and how do kind of people negotiate those interactions, those spaces? And I'm also wondering too, and one of the things that we kind of see, like even in the colonial Kenya example, is that people believe the state cannot protect them from witchcraft. And so it seems like you have a very similar thing here. So how does that play into how people view the legitimacy of these formal versus informal systems of law?
Should I go ahead and jump in right away?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. So yeah, thank you so much. If you would be willing to put the book you mentioned in the chat, that would be awesome, because I haven't come across that one. And I think that would be really interesting for me to think about. So in terms of how they've been handled in the past, the information that I got through interviews and through sort of my field work was that in the past, the Mwami, the local highest sort of leader, would be in charge of sort of witches and witchcraft accusations, and sort of kept order around that more than like did dispute resolution like he would also, but he also just kind of kept order around how witchcraft was used or not used. And it kind of, it's not that people didn't perceive it as happening, but it's sort of my interpretation was that it seemed like less of an immediate threat to people and more of something that existed, but was kind of ordered and structured and that sort of thing. With the years of conflict, you know, following colonialism and you know, other things that have disrupted sort of traditional, if you will, authority patterns, right? That sort of broke down, and the Mwami doesn't really play that role anymore. So it's left this gap in terms of how witchcraft can be ordered or dealt with or anything along those lines. And the state has not picked it up, right? So it's just kind of left in limbo. Now, in terms of mediation, there are like local NGOs and local elders or chiefs, both sort of administrative chiefs, so bringing the state back in, right? But also sort of traditional or other types of chiefs who will deal with cases of witchcraft if they're brought to them. But because they really focus on mediation and just, you know, will typically provide the decision that this particular case is not a case of witchcraft. So not challenging that witchcraft exists, but as a way of mitigating violence, right? We'll just say this is not a case of witchcraft, and we'll sort of help the different people sort of understand that, or whatever it may be. So you do have a number of different actors there. But the legal system, if we look at that side of things, right? And as you were asking, you know, prosecutors, judges, you know, how are they sort of interacting, even if in informal ways, right? And what I really got is that they all believe in witchcraft as well. Like I spoke with various people, from judges to legal aides, prosecutors. They all believe in witchcraft. They told me about instances of judges falling victim to witchcraft during trials and this sort of thing. Like they don't have any doubt that it exists, but they're following and implementing the law. And this was something I mentioned yesterday, which is really sort of interesting, is that part of what people perceive as a problem with the legal system is that it actually functions sometimes, right? Not all the time, but sometimes. And so when you get these, a refusal to hear witchcraft cases, and when you have situations, I was talking yesterday about, sort of repeat offenders being released, that's often because they're actually following the legal procedure. I'm not trying to claim that there's no corruption and there's no payments and there's none of that going on. But that lack of trust, as you were sort of getting at with the legal system, and as Chris was sort of getting at, is definitely there. But when I look at other cases in the book, statutory rape, for example, people don't necessarily go to the legal system to deal with them. But there's much more sort of embracing of, well, what does the law say about this? What does, the law is good. They just don't deal with it the way we want to deal with it. So this is really different than those other cases. And I think that's why I'm having problems sort of fitting it into the broader argument. So I don't know, I think I kind of touched on all your questions, I hope. Awesome, thank you. They were great questions.
Anyone else want to chime in? We still have some time.
Yeah, I just want to
go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Mention quickly to Holly that in some African countries you have two systems of law. Basically, you have the old one and I would say the European one. Mm-hmm. And so the old one is able to deal with conflicts, witchcrafts, and many things. I'm thinking about Burkina Faso, for example. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is a way they have to solve conflicts through the old system that is actually taking less time and is very efficient. So what do you think about that? Is that the same in the Congo, the DRC? Do we have this possibility as well?
So that's exactly was sort of the starting point, was sort of understanding that there might be a more localized historical or traditional approach to doing things, and then that also coexisting with the state legal system. But what I found in Congo is it's just so much more complex. There is so much going on in terms of the integration of like historical beliefs and practices around law and justice with the state. And I think a lot of that has to do with all this mobilization around ending wartime rape and that sort of diffusing out to the legal system more broadly. And sort of a lot of, one of my earlier chapters, I talk about the sort of widespread sensibilisation around the laws and the legal system, and that really getting integrated into people's understandings of law. And then you have the NGO world, and those who were listening to the presentation yesterday about NGOs, right? The NGOs are everywhere, and they're all vying for the international resources. And one way to do that is through doing conflict resolution mediation in accordance with sort of international human rights standards, but at the same time recognizing that locally those don't always fit with people's sort of perceptions, understandings. Then you have community elders, you have chiefs, both administrative and traditional, you have religious leaders. So the terrain of legality is just so complex. There isn't like this just two-system approach to law, and that's really what I've been trying to get at and like tease out, is what's being constructed here is just beyond sort of the expectations of interveners and traditional leaders essentially as well.
All
right, thanks for that. Professor Kisa had his hand up a minute ago.
Oh yeah, thanks guys. So I have a question first for Adrian. Why do you want to rescue the concept of political stability if it's being discarded? What's the justification for you trying to reclaim and rehabilitate what you think is a concept that is being discarded? I would be curious to know what is at stake. What's the big deal? And so, and on to Holly, I have a number of things to say about this whole idea of witchcraft, but I wanted you to help clarify what are you thinking about when you talk about hybridity? Is that at the institutional level, or at the behavioral level, or perhaps both? I mean, what's this hybridity about? But I think also that this whole notion of the dual existence of witchcraft has something to do with problems of the secular state. So secularism is going to try and keep spirituality out of the realm of public spaces, but people are not spiritual. Many people are very spiritual, and I think there's a lot about witchcraft, which is actually about spirituality, and spirituality is a matter of belief and faith. It doesn't matter whether witchcraft is actually real. I actually think it's not, but people believe it is, and they work with that faith and belief, in the same way that, a Christian will believe that Jesus Christ was crucified, even when perhaps there is no evidence that indeed happened. And so, so for me, it's one thing about belief and faith on the one hand versus reality, and the fact that witchcraft actually does does exist. And so that divide, and at the end of the day, it's going to be down to what people's faiths are, and now increasingly actually, because I think you also need to realize that witchcraft has, like many other things, is not static, and it's not operating on the same registers permanently. Increasingly now, what you find is that in fact witchcraft is playing out in evangelical Christian circles, even far more than it does play out in sort of the traditional African faith, spaces. And that, I think, speaks to the point that Chris was making about the entrepreneurship of witchcraft. I look at it as, traditional witchcraft actors as entrepreneurs. Now that entrepreneurship has increasingly been taken on by evangelizing pastors who are really businessmen and women, yeah. So anyway, those are my quick comments. But I mean, witchcraft is an interesting subject, and it's always nice, listening to people speak about it. And thanks for the talk.
All right.
So
Holly,
and Adrian, why don't you go ahead and respond, and then I will go to Jasmine's question.
all right. So thank you for your question, Moses. So when I started a project in 2018, I did not realize that people are moving away from the concept, but it's not really. I would amend that statement by saying that it's really the people in the development study. The people in development study, they are moving away from political stability. But the people like myself who are doing a conflict study, we are still finding stability and crisis and armed conflict as still useful concepts. But I'm writing a book for a broader audience, and because of that, I have to justify why political stability is still useful concept. And I think I also have a good reason for sticking with stability, and that's the reason based on the measurement. So far, I read many things about especially the Fund for Peace, fragility state index, and I'm not sure that they really capture the the problem of conflict in stability. So it's not really a substitution. It's really more about the environment of a state. In fragility, you're talking about social cohesion, legitimacy, and all of that. That's not really what I'm trying to understand. What I'm trying to understand is why people are fighting and making, the state unstable, making, coup d'etat and making political violence frequent in Africa. So that's the reason. Yeah.
So on the question of hybridity, I don't focus so much on sort of formal institutionalized hybridity. So for example, in the lower courts, in the Tribunal de Paix, they have, when they hear customary cases, they will include customary authorities on the bench with the judges to advise. So I would see that as sort of a formalized hybridity. I'm looking at more at these sort of patterns that emerge sort of less formally. So the ones that I focus on is really this view and understanding that the law is good. So mediators and those who help people with disputes will often cite the law. This is what the law says. You're not using the legal system. You're not going to go to the courts. We're going to help you resolve it. But this is what the law says, and you need to know that. It's important that you understand and know the law. And we're going to resolve it this way because of a focus for a lot of these everyday harms on restorative and reconciliation, which is not to romanticize those concepts. It's just what, in my research, people tended to want for those everyday harms and disputes, rather than going through the formal proceedings and having punishment and fines and stuff like that. And then the second sort of theme that really emerged is using the legal system as a threat. So whether people go to village elders or whether they go to NGOs, they say, if you don't adhere to these rulings, you're going to go to the legal system. Like, that is the big threat. It's the legal system itself, rather than, sort of punishment or something, or that's seen as the punishment. So some of these sort of unexpected patterns of like, okay, we respect the law, you should know the law, but the legal system is this sort of threatening thing. And we can imagine all the reasons why for that. And, I get into that in other chapters. And the problems of the secular state, I think, is a really great point. I didn't think about it in that ways, but that kind of maps on to my understanding, right, of this, the liberal legalism and that sort of scientific rationality of what is evidence of something or proof or something along those lines. So I think that fits, very much with what you're saying about this secular state. And that's not how people live their lives, right, necessarily in this sort of secular world. And so that doesn't, there's a gap there. In the socio-legal studies, we talk about the gap between, the law in the books and the law in practice and these sorts of things. And that's sort of what I see there. And your point about witchcraft not being static and these sort of witch doctors as entrepreneurs. Oh my gosh, everybody's an entrepreneur in Uvira. Like people are, it's a difficult situation. It's post-conflict. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of corruption, and people find ways of, doing things. So the witch doctors in that sense, yes, but I think what's more sort of interesting to me about witchcraft not being static is exactly your point. And I have this whole other paper I've started on the politicization of witchcraft in the churches specifically, and the accusations, and that being a real way to sort of get people out of positions of power in these churches that have a lot of power locally, and that sort of thing. So I think that's really important, and I kind of put that in a whole other category, but I'm rethinking this whole chapter, so I don't know, that might come back in. Thank you.
All right, well, we had Gabriel was here a second ago, and I wanted to call on her, but she seems to have wandered off. So does anybody else have anything to ask or comment on for our panelists? Well, if not, we have a little bit of a break before the business meeting. And I hope to see Chris and Holly there, because we're having a big election in a few minutes. So, if everyone's there, everyone might have to do, oh, and Moses too. We might have to do a little, campaigning. So go take a break, and I'll see you guys soon. Thanks, y'all. Nicely done.
Everyone, thanks.